I'm just looking around the room. I always like to start these conversations in gallery view, so that we can just see who are we in the room with. So if you can, I know that some of you are going to be listening, but if you can just put on video for a second so that we can say, okay, these are the people that we're co-creating with in this conversation. Hello, Chelsea. I love the wave. And I see some familiar faces like Mark, and I'm seeing Celia. You guys, Celia, would you raise your hand again? Celia is like, yeah, that's right, raise the house. Celia is a queen of communications and media. She's actually one of the people who taught me and opened the doors to what I know about communication for change and social impact. And we got to work on some amazing projects together over the years. She's one of my queen inspires, and I've emailed her no less than 5 times the last 2 weeks, telling her how much I miss her when doing these kinds of events of inspiring lots of noise about opportunities. And so it's exciting to have her in the house. And I'm just seeing other familiars, Mark Smith and some new faces. It's just a pleasure to see you. So today we are about to have a conversation about something that is just so dear and close to my heart. And it is about, how do we work with story and climate? And I don't even like using the word climate when we start talking about this. It's like, how are we talking about our relationship to the environment? And I don't even like using the word environment, because even that's a little, I don't know, sterile to me. It's like, how do we talk about our relationship with our mother? How do we talk about our relationship with this thing from which we get our life force and our energy from and with? And so in one of our last classes, someone said something that I found really inspiring, where he said, I learned today about the slight shift of a word. And I was like, really? I love learning these things. What do you mean? And he said, rather than peace on earth, what if we talked about peace with earth? Just a mere little preposition changes the whole conversation, right? So we're gonna get into the details of this. Now, look, this topic, it can be considered dry, boring, and uninteresting, and something that anyone in their sane mind would want to avoid. So our goal today is to have fun. Consider this like we're having a little coffee talk. Feel free to, bring your voice, your ideas. We're going to be talking about different questions together. But let me introduce you to these 2 incredible women that I'm really honored to be talking with today. Allison Begalman, can raise her hand. And I just met her through the Hollywood Climate Summit, and I was really inspired by what she was doing. I've been watching this happen for a couple of years. I'm like, thank God somebody is doing this, in terms of really bringing forth the conversation to people who have probably the loudest voice. Not necessarily the most influential, not necessarily the most meaningful, but definitely the loudest voice in our world right now. And she is the CEO of Impact. I love that. There's an exclamation mark in it. The co-founder and EP of the Hollywood Climate Summit, and she's the creator of the USC School of Cinematic Arts' first ever social impact screenwriters lecture, Call to Action, Writing Stories of Relevance and Social Impact. I already have a crush on her. And hold on, I've got to admit people while I keep doing this. And Allison has spoken at Paramount Global, New York University, University of Southern California, Edinburgh, and Harvard University, and more. I'm sad to say that Janelle is not with us, and we were expecting her to be with us today, but she has got that crud that's going around. So, but Casey Rogers was always planned. They kind of said that out of order. I should have said introduce Casey first and then talked about who's not here. But I'm looking at the bio, so excuse me for that. So Casey Rogers, I'm just delighted to start to get to know and have been learning about her passion around really telling the whole story. And we're going to get to more about that in just a minute. But she's the founder and CEO of, do I say it, Telia Insights? Is that right? Telia. Oh, it's gorgeous. It's like lyrical. She's also the Chief Mobilizing Officer. Isn't that a cool title? Of Daughters of the Earth. She brings forth over 20 years of experience in nonprofit, philanthropic, and business sectors. And she's worked for a long time. She has got the long view perspective of positive change with a focus on tangible impact and bold results. Casey launched the Ellen Fund in 2018 and led the organization through a multi-million-dollar initiative focused on global conservation and drawing on 2 decades of experience of working in Southern and East Africa. So we have a real great variety of experience. And I should tell you about, why am I talking about this? As you guys know, I'm the founder of the School for Sacred Storytelling, but that came after a decade of working in social impact on climate. And I was one of the hosts and the producer of the Green Channel at Al Gore's television network. I've covered environmental issues for many, many years, writing for Fast Company, Spirituality and Health Magazine, National Geographic Newswatch. And then I also covered the climate talks in Paris and was one of two people who did live coverage of the Copenhagen climate talks. So this idea of how do we tell the story of our time, and how do we talk about at such a, it does feel like we're at a pivotal moment. That's the story that's being told, that we're in this critical pivotal moment together, and what a moment to be alive together and being storytellers. So I wanted to start with just this question. And again, I even want to invite Allison and Casey, I want to hear your questions that are alive in you as they come up. But why do we care? Why do we care about the role of story and how it's used in our conversation around the environment? And by the way, for all of you, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. Let's make this as wild and as interesting as we want it to be. So yeah, why do we care?
Casey, you want to go?
I'll just say a quick thing and then happy for you to jump in, which is to say that, I've certainly observed over the course of my life that where so much of the talk about the environment and climate, say in the 80s and 90s, resided was in facts, what's wrong, oppositional. And my observation, just my lived experience, is that was not swaying a lot of people, and it was not touching people's hearts and making people feel a real resonance with that message. And so to me, it's looking at what wasn't working sort of in the early part of my life and thinking that it's really a different approach to exciting and sparking people's love of peace with Earth, as you said, Leah, that really drives me to feel as though story is, the method of sparking that interest and ultimate love and desire.
I'll take the more technical response. I so resonate with all of that. Honestly, all we have is story at this point. All we have are social media videos and news articles and headlines and content being thrown at us all day long. And of course, there's story in that, but people are using it. They're using it to thwart, to do bad things, to do good things. And I think if we are coming together, I think everyone in this space wants to make systemic change with their storytelling, whatever medium you do it through. So I think, with climate being one of the most biggest emergencies of our time, I think it's really important for us to think about, how do we become climate literate so that we then can use it for good, use this power for good, because it's a bit scary. And I think in those times we need to build community and also build our own confidence.
I really appreciate what you're talking about in terms of it being a little bit scary. And that's that's the thing that keeps coming up for me for this whole summit is why is it meaningful? Why should we actually be gathering around as storytellers talking about what it means to be a storyteller in this time? And this idea of, we wield so much power. We wield so much power, and with great power comes great responsibility. And, one of the things that I was really noticing in my time of working with filmmakers who wanted to make an impact and influence with their storytelling, and especially working in the environmental movement, so I started seeing a lot of things where people with really good intentions were causing some good harm by telling dangerous stories. And I'm just curious, Allison, you're a writer as well as a producer, and you've worked with companies like CIA and Annapurna Pictures, and you've as well as on shows such as TV's Preacher and Hulu's Monsterland. And when you start thinking about creating as a creator, about these kinds of topics, what's top of mind for you? Like, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, I've thought about a lot of things. I think the thing we need to do now is, if you are climate literate and the top line stories, and I think a lot of folks who are already in this sphere like are able to like, maybe telling a story example, it's set in a doctor show, set in an ER, and folks are coming in during a heat wave, and different communities are coming in more severely impacted because of where they live, right? And because of the color of their skin and the marginalization that comes with that. And that's a climate story. And so I feel like that, for people who are already like really versed in climate, that might be a more, like, of course, duh. But I think something deeper that I like to talk about a lot is like an intergenerational story, right? One of the biggest solutions to the climate emergency is building relationships between older and younger generations, and having deep and empathic, empathetic conversations where we're really seeing each other's humanity. And because at the end of the day, it's like the people in power are older, and I mean, I'm 29, and a lot of folks in my space who are my age still feel very disempowered by folks in power. And we've proven that we can do the work. And so I think that's a story that there's so many ways to tell an intergenerational story. If you think about the show Hacks, I see that as a climate story. I mean, they make great climate mentions on that show, but seeing them as truly friends and basically mentoring each other, like, that is so special. And everyone should check out the organization Co-Generate if you don't know about them, but they do really incredible intergenerational work. And they have a fellowship too. And then I think also just like any story that is featuring an Indigenous protagonist is a climate story. Like, I don't care I don't care if it's a love story, if it's, a coming of age story, it doesn't matter. Like, at the end of the day, we need to be amplifying the voices and the representation of Indigenous people, because they are on the front lines doing this work. So to me, that's another sort of less obvious climate story that we should be thinking about as we are creating our own narratives. But obviously, if you are not Indigenous, you should make sure to work with someone who is Indigenous and give them proper credit if you are going to create that story.
Thank you for speaking about that responsibility in terms of allyship and how to create, touching the beginning of how to begin to come into partnership around that. And I really appreciate what you're talking about in terms of intergenerational stories and where change happens. When we were looking at how to make change in terms of stories, one of my favorite examples is how the Stop Smoking campaign was started. They didn't go after adults, they went after children. I don't know if you guys remember this. This was when I was a kid. They came straight after us when we were like kids in school. And they told us all these horror stories about the bad things that would happen if you smoked. And so, I was one of those kids that went home to my mom, and she reminds me of this almost every time I see her, that the reason why she quit smoking is because I went home one day and I said, if you end up in the hospital because you get lung cancer from smoking, I'm not going to visit you. Hardcore kid. I was never that hardcore. But, in terms of look at social impact messaging, super, super impactful, right? They went to the kids, parents care about their kids, and so where do we get how do we get a crack into the conversation of family systems and where real change happens?
I would also say that, and I'll just recount a story of a colleague who, we were both, listening to a speaker who was talking about, what's your climate story, right? What's your climate narrative? That we all have one if we're willing to think about it and frame it. And she had a huge aha moment. And she said to me, I just realized in this moment that my family came to California. I'm a Californian because of the Oklahoma, Dust Bowl. And that is my climate story, which she just in that moment really accessed and realized that her grandparents were part of that, her parents were part of that, she was part of that. And it is a climate migration story but it's never framed in that way. I mean, certainly when you're reading The Grapes of Wrath and things like that, it comes to mind. But I'm just advocating the idea of encouraging all of us to think of our climate story, and also being in conversation with other generations about that, right? Because as you both were saying, they're interconnected. And as I know from my own experience, my grandparents weren't living in a disposable world as we are now, right? Their practices and their habits were very resourceful and very aware of sort of limited access. And some of those practices, which are only, 60, 70 years sort of away, are such good remembrance of sort of what we need to be embracing.
I love that. And, again, it's like you're talking about deep storytelling. It's like, right, when we get to be remembered, be reminded, or be taught that there are other ways of living other than the excess, and the people that live that way have not forgotten. It's like, it's not like we're going towards some crazy future of doing, it's like, it's all the memories are spelled right here. I also just really appreciate what you were talking about in terms of your climate story. I want to hear. I'm so curious if anyone got inspired by that, and place in the chat, like, what is your climate? I'm like, gosh, what's my climate story? And so I want to encourage people to put that in there. I also want to pick up Florence's question, because I think this is so great. I want to engage my friends who I think could be climate energy transition leaders, or maybe community leaders, but don't yet see themselves in this moment at all. Okay.
So I love what Florence said here, because hi, Florence, you're not alone. So Daughters for Earth, the organization that Leah mentioned I'm a part of, is highly aware that if women aren't more included in climate solutions, we're missing the point, right? Because women are already highly connected to the environment for a variety of reasons, and in many ways holding the front lines of climate action. But in so many communities, that isn't the view that these women have of themselves, right? They're planting mangroves because they need to repair the area that their family lives in, or they're devising water catchment systems because this is something essential for their community. They would never claim, oh yes, I'm a climate leader and that's why I'm planting mangroves, or that's why I'm doing water catchment. And I see your thought about wanting to inspire your friends along that same spectrum, which is like, how do we all activate to really see that whether we're, on some fancy podium or in another space that might seem more humble, that we all can be that, move into that climate leader space.
Allison, I saw you nodding your head a lot.
I mean, this is like it's my favorite thing to talk about, because my background's in community organizing. I've been organizing since I was 19. Started in college, and I didn't even know I was doing it at the time. I was in film school, and I just didn't see like the men and the women working together, and the men were getting all the opportunities, and I didn't understand why. So I started organizing the women and the queer folks. And I say this because, like, I think that's when you start doing the work, is when you're passionate about something and that you need to bring people together in order to move that thing forward. And the reality is that now intersectional environmentalism, like literally every social justice issue, is connected back to the climate crisis. So, Casey's speaking to women's rights. If you are interested in literally anything, if you're interested in racial justice, if you're interested in mobility, you want to see that there's biking in your community, that's climate work. Like, and I think for, speaking to other people, I'm not like the person to ask like, oh, this is exactly what you should say. But I always think about it as like asking a lot of questions to really figure out like, what do they care about? And then from there being like, okay, well, here is how this is related. Or if it's your neighbor and that there's something going on in your community, like, how can you sort of make that connection subtly so that they're not feeling like that you're like talking down to them and being like, oh, the activist is talking to me again, which I'm sure many of us in this space have been sort of pinpointed as that, and instead just you know, being a friend, and then they can take that next step, and if they want support, they can.
You know, I always point to, just to echo what you're saying, Allison, this beautiful description that Dr. Ayanna Johnson writes about, which is really a Venn diagram for climate action. And she is an ocean conservationist, you know, her passion, but she's also authored books and won many awards. Definitely somebody to check out if you're not already aware of her. But she, you know, basically says that there's so much to do as it relates to climate, that there's space for everybody. And that the best approach is to figure out where are your skills and passions and where are the climate needs in the world and where does that intersect? Because any of us are going to go longer and harder at something that we have a passion for. And that's really what we're looking at, right? Like, we'd rather marathoners than sprinters, you know, at this point in terms of climate action. And it also makes the point that there's no wrong answer, right? Like, if you're super excited about biking, as Allison said, like, there's a place for you. And if it's women's rights, there's a place for you. And if it's, you know, endangered species conservation, there's a place for you, right?
It goes back to that Jacques Cousteau quote, like, we protect the things we love.
Exactly.
If we had my way, we just work the word activist out of our language, you know, because I'm like, why is it that just because you're doing something that you really care about, that all of a sudden you've become identified as a separate person other than just living life that serves life, you know? And I'm like, I don't know, it's like a lover of life. Maybe I would rather be called that name, like, call me lol, I don't know. You know, it's like, rather than an activist. Celia's asking a question that's getting a lot of thumbs up and hearts, so it's a great one. Curious about motivation and emotional arcs in your storytelling. How much do you go to fear and despair versus possibility and hope? Are you using the classic story arcs? How do you feel about sci-fi and dystopian stories? That was like 20 questions in one, but we'll see. We'll get them all. Who feels compelled?
I might go. So it's actually interesting because when I started in writing and television writing specifically, like, I was doing a lot of sci-fi, and I honestly I didn't watch a lot of sci-fi growing up, so I don't know what drew me to it, but I then realized it was because, you know, I could envision a different world, one that I actually wanted to, like, that got me excited to be a queer person, to be a woman, to be an activist. So I started in that, but I've also always been a comedy writer. So for me, when I think about telling climate stories, and I'm also going to drop in the chat one of my clients' organizations that I helped start, Good Energy, they literally created a playbook that talks about climate storytelling in a narrative way. So I'll drop the link to there, and then it's an incredible playbook that can basically answer your question better than me talking. But all to say is, like, I root it in humor. I think that's the next frontier. There's also a great group of comedians that we work with all the time called the Climate Comedy Cohort, and they are literally telling jokes about the climate crisis, but in a way that's not just, oh, it's about recycling, because, like, we're so beyond that. It's about, they talk about coming together as a collective, and politics, and human related stories, right? I think there's just so much to say in comedy. And in terms of dystopic, so look, at the end of the day, like, I don't think anyone should tell you what to write, but as the movement is really trying to move away from dystopic stories, especially apocalyptic stories, because at the end of the day, it's like, we've seen those, they're out. If you want to watch it, go, there's a million movies to watch, and instead sort of solutions oriented, and or just feeling like there's tangible next steps. And again, like, if you look at the Good Energy playbook, they'll give you a million ideas, but yeah, I think hope's cool, but I don't think it needs to be, like, preachy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I vote hope and solutions every day, all day. But I think that you're right. It needs to be nuanced. It needs to be done in an elegant way so that it doesn't feel preachy and, you know, icky. We all, like, know that feeling when you're like, oh no, okay, I'm going to change what I'm watching because it just feels too far. I think that the flip on sci-fi that I would offer is how to create narratives that aren't about our current world, but aren't dystopian, right? They're actually painting a picture that we wish for, that is about peace with Earth, that is about harmony, reciprocity, like a realigning of relationships, whether it be ours and the Earth, or whether it be, you know, human to human relationship or other sentient beings. Like, to me, that's a really effective space, you know, for storytellers to move into, because we can't, or it's very difficult to create what we don't envision. And as you said, Allison, we, like, if you want dystopian, it's there, right? And I think to some extent, you know, I see in the chat, you know, this idea of like feeling overwhelmed and anxious, and that feeds into it, and it really brings about a paralysis. But if you believe that there's solutions, and you've seen a way that this world could operate that would be healing and restorative, then that's what's in your mind day in and day out, and that's far more productive from my perspective.
Yeah, and just getting into the science of storytelling that we know, again, like great power comes great responsibility. It's like, you know, in one of our other classes, I talk a little bit about the neuroscience of storytelling, but, you know, when I start activating a story, it starts taking over my right lobe of my brain, and it starts activating the right lobe of your brain. And we start literally co-creating reality together. It is so powerful of these humans. And so this idea of right, like, what are we doing? And I often think about this, and I've started getting really diligent about what stories I'm even willing to take in, because each one of them starts to take up real estate in my consciousness. And do I want my consciousness to be filled with this dystopian future? Not personally, no, I'm not. You know, there's a fine line between like facing what's happening and like the possibility. This is where I feel like as storytellers, it's like the truth is when I look out my window right now, we have a peach tree with 30 peaches that hit the ground. This has never happened because everyone else has fought to get to those peaches before I could get to them. And this year they're there. And so I'm really like, I'm in the absence of what's there. I was trying not to go there, but that's actually where I have to go right now. I was going to say, right now, it's like the birds are out. You know, there's still plenty of things happening and plenty of lizards, and there's lots of beauty and that's happening right now. And can we be in that celebration? But this idea of what is our responsibility of storytellers, if we know that we can pave the road to what's real, and if we understand that these stories are operating systems, and that people will find their belief systems, their values, and the roles that they play in the world inside the stories that we give, then what is our responsibility, and how compelled can we be to make sure that we are paving the road towards a beautiful world? How many of you guys saw The Fifth Sacred Thing? I'm going to put you guys, like, who here read The Fifth Sacred Thing by Starhawk? Oh, this is so sweet. Nobody? Oh my God. Okay, a couple of hands. Okay. I mean, when I first came into that, to seeing that, it blew my mind, because I had never heard a story that showed me what was on the other side of the nightmare that was being sold to me. My whole life I was being raised with the nightmare of what we were doomed for. And all of a sudden Starhawk gave us another way. And I was like, oh, you mean, I mean, it wasn't all that cheery, but there were ways that people were still engaging in a loving, good life. And I was like, wow, that it's possible. And that was probably one of the key moments in my life when I started to really realize, like, we can actually carve new pathways in people's realm of possibility. And when we create a new possibility, then we have new actions, new roles that we can all take. It's pretty phenomenal. I want to start thinking about stories that we've seen that nailed it. You know, that we're like, do we have them? Have we seen a story about the environment, or a story that teaches us how to be with the earth, or a story that brings us closer, where they're like, wow, like something came from their avatar I'm seeing.
I mean, I can give an example, which I don't think will resonate with many people, but you can find it online. It's a Kenyan series called Wildlife Warriors, which is led by Paula Kahumbu, a Nat Geo explorer and a conservationist in her own right. And it's a episodic piece. It's on Kenyan cable, and it's all about the natural resources and wildlife in Kenya. And she's recently integrated kids into this, whether it's like as field trips or as co-hosts. And there are versions in English and versions in Swahili. And first of all, these are fun to watch. Like, regardless of where you are, if you have any connection to Kenya or not, they're fun to watch. Number two, Paula's Kenyan, and she's talking with Kenyan conservationists and Kenyan scientists and leaders, and everything is hyper local, but in a way that has a relevance, or that you can have an appreciation for, outside of that local context. And she, really had to fight her way to make this happen, right? Philanthropic dollars and GoFundMe sites and things like that. But she did it. And, she's now getting a lot of acclaim. And I feel like while that doesn't have like the Netflix behind it, or, some huge streaming opportunity, it's out there. You can probably find it on YouTube. And to me, it's a really shining example of showing solutions, local engagement, local storytelling, and just fun and warm-hearted.
Love that.
Sounds awesome.
Yeah.
I'm excited to watch it. There's so many great examples. There's some great, oh yeah, I love Nayeli Kobo. She was at the summit this year. Anyone who doesn't know who Nayeli is, like, should look her up. Sorry, I was just reflecting on that message. Her story is incredible. But yeah, I want to speak to a podcast that I think is something very, very helpful for anyone who wants to learn more about like these types of stories. So Amy Westervelt, who's an incredible environmental reporter, she basically created the like True Crime Climate podcast. And she does this by sort of unraveling a different true crime thing that happened with climate every season. And so like the third season is about like the PR, like publishers and the PR space, and how they sort of put fossil fuels on the map in a lot of ways, and were paid by a lot of money to basically talk about, make us believe that fossil fuels are needed, and that they're necessary, and it's kind
carbon
of
footprint.
Exactly, yeah. So I'll drop in the chat. It's called Drilled, the series. But I mean, there's other TV shows that I think do a great job, obviously, like Grey's Anatomy weirdly has a lot of climate storylines. I think certain shows are getting better at weaving that in. There's a great one in Ted Lasso in season 1 that has to do with oil. So yeah, I think, there's a lot of different, I don't think it needs to always be like, oh, it's fully about this. I think it can just have pieces of it that are rooted in character and place, and the dialogue, and then you can just experience that, so you're not, again, like being hit on the head with anything.
So I'm embarrassed to share what came to mind when I asked that question. And I don't remember that Ted Lasso show. I want to go back and find it. They did such a good job. Ted Lasso did such a great job of integrating social issues without it feeling like an after-school special. And I think that's one of the things, right? It's like there are some shows out there that are now trying to be so politically correct and say everything right. That's like, they're not fun. It's like, come on, like we do go to TV and for entertainment, and so it's like, there's this aspect of like, let us laugh about this, for heaven's sakes, let us have some fun. But when the idea that came to mind, and here I am, Little House on the Prairie, which I was not expecting to say, but I don't know how many of you guys like read Little House on the Prairie as a kid, but one of the things that it taught me was about valuing what you have and rationing resources. And it stayed with me a whole lifetime. Like I'll be giving my niece that whole series just so that it's a great foundation. But I was also just thinking of like, different ideas of like, Don't Look Up. I know that a lot of people hated that movie. I loved it. I thought that they nailed it, and it's like, there are so many ways that to get people to the table without thinking that they're going to a climate thing. It's like, again, like, how do we find that back table, the back door? Okay, so let's learn some things together. Have you seen examples? And we're not doing this to critique or attack, but just to like have an interesting conversation of how can we learn from the other people's mistakes? We're gonna call it a mistake. Have we seen examples of something that you're like, that went left of center in terms of you might actually have done more harm than good in terms of the climate narrative? And I'm going to give you guys an example of one that I've been working with for a long time. And we call this, it's like an example of zombie storytelling or dangerous storytelling, where it's like when we look at things through the lens of sacred storytelling, which is what we're here doing at the Sacred Storytelling Summit, is like, is this a story that's serving life? It's kind of the basic question. Is it bringing us together? Is it creating connection? Is it life force giving? And so oftentimes I look at stories, it's like, are you a life force giving story, or are you feeding on life? And how do we like look at that? When after I've received this television show or this movie, do I feel more enlivened and inspired and like ready to go get him, Tiger? Or do I want to go die a little because I've been told once again that humans are the scum of the earth and should be rid of, which is a bizarre narrative, and like who's writing that story? And so one of the stories that I saw is one of the most dangerous stories on earth is Jaws. And we always go back to like, how was it made? Like, what was the intention behind it? Who were its creators? And, Peter Benchley had heard a great story about the great white sharks and was really curious and ended up writing this story about it. And when Steven Spielberg picked it up, and what did he want at the time to be a big famous director? It was the second film I think that he ever made. Something that's interesting, and I want to talk about this in terms of storytelling, was that it was filmed on the ocean. And we have to look at things in the context of when they were made. It was the very first film ever filmed out on the ocean. And what is the ocean? Like, whether or not we speak symbols, like symbols speak us, like the ocean is our consciousness. It represents our consciousness. So here, all of a sudden, we have one of the oldest, scariest stories on earth being told, which is our fear of death, now being symbolized by a shark, implanted right into the center of our consciousness through this film on oceans. And what happened was like a global massive fear, more than anyone had ever seen before. And when Peter Benchley started to understand what had happened and the danger that then sharks were put into, this keystone species that our health is related to, he spent the rest of his life as an ocean protector. So I say this as a cautionary tale because it's not like, he went out to write a bad story. I don't think anyone goes out to write a bad story. I think as creatives, we're constantly being inspired, always. And it's a responsibility to start asking, but why do I want to put that in the world? And what will it do? What else will it inspire? Any other learning examples that people have seen along the way where they learned, oh, they did something and I'm going to do something. I'm going to go this way based on what I learned from them, because that's what we're doing. That's what storytelling is. We get to evolve together.
Well, I don't have like a big sweeping answer. Like I don't have one specific one, because I also am just like, there's some movies that are just like outdated. Like that was the belief at that time. And that was the dominant trope of environmentalist and storytelling. And I guess because I mentioned Grey's Anatomy and I feel like a lot of people know what it is. There's an episode, I don't know what season, I think like 5 or 6 or whatever. There's a lot of seasons. But it's basically one of the like guest star roles is this woman who fell from a tree, and she was basically an activist who was trying to protect this tree from being bulldozed over by a construction company, and they were trying to turn it into a mall or whatever. And it was like a very, very old tree. And well, of course, like I love every story about an activist. The whole thing painted this activist as very radical. There was a lot of jokes about, and I know they were well-meaning, but I think at the end of the day, we need to de-radicalize all activists generally in storytelling. And that's always the biggest trope, is like, it's a young person, they're an activist, they are weird, and so basically, I mean, by the end, there was a great piece of it where her and her sister ended up bonding, because her sister was a lawyer and she decided they were going to sue this the construction company, which was great. But just the way that the activist was depicted, the environmentalist was depicted, was negative. And I think at the end of the day, like, we want to uplift anyone who is an environmentalist and also make them look like everyday people. Like there's this show on NPR Chris Duffy, who I'm friends with, he is a comedian, and he basically, it's an older show, but he used to interview different people in science who like do wild things, but sort of humanize them by saying that they're like everyday people. And so I think that's what we need to do. Yes, Julia Butterfly Hill. That's exactly right. Anyway, so that's sort of what I would add to this.
Yeah, Leah, I did not bring my like naughty list, right? Of like
It's not a thing that we normally talk about, but I figure it's like we get to learn from it. So
yeah, no, but I think that, you know, what I'm reminded with the Jaws example is just like know better, do better, right? You know, and Allison, you were right to say like, you know, an awareness or a frame of mind that was of a time and place needs to be understood in that time and place, right? And it's, you know, impressive that he then went on to spend decades, literally, right, speaking tours and talking about sort of like trying to make right what the film portrayed. And, you know, I think that's important for any creator, right? Whether it's storytelling or, you know, other forms of art. I mean, I think that, you know, I have to tell you a little story to get back to my point, which is that through the Ellen Fund, we were really interested in, you know, having media that talked about the conservation work that we were supporting, but wanted to do it in a way that was of the place, right? And so the majority of our support was invested in Rwanda, focused on gorilla conservation. And we ultimately invested in a film production company that grew to be, you know, 10 filmmakers broad and brought in a lot of other business besides the Ellen Fund. And the reason we did that is because we, you know, were sort of being approached and encouraged to hire outside filmmakers, right, to capture footage and to tell stories. And while we didn't go that route, I just share it because it is an example of a situation where we didn't go through necessarily, you know, in that direction, but it was certainly what was recommended and encouraged and sort of purported to be what we should have done. But that wasn't, you know, in line with values, where we knew the best stories would come from, and, you know, and how we wanted to spend resources.
Casey, I just wanted to say, you've done a lot of work, you know, Daughters of the Earth, of telling specific stories. And can you talk a little bit about, you know, your guys' approach of telling those really personal stories?
Yeah, absolutely. We're actually just in later this month launching a series of graphic novels that are telling stories of women who receive funding from Daughters for Earth and who are at the front line of climate action. Daughters for Earth has granted several $1 million to women-led climate action projects around the world, primarily in either nature conservation or regenerative agriculture. And the idea is, you know, to bring those stories to life. And, you know, these are women who, as I said earlier, right, they're dedicating either their entire life or a portion of their life to climate action. They, in some cases, are very well known, you know, award-winning women. Some of their stories are lesser known, but we really feel as though this idea of bringing forth dozens and dozens of stories and being able to put them out through our network is an important way of raising the profile of climate leaders, one. Number two, you know, showing one another that there is this much larger community that exists and that is engaged in really productive work, you know, alongside, right? Not necessarily shoulder to shoulder, but in sort of like a global community kind of way. And also having an access point for, you know, Florence and your friends, right? Who might just want like an easy breezy way to be thinking about how to get involved in climate work, and you know, a graphically beautiful, you know, short personal story might be a really good hook for some.
Thank you. I'm seeing a couple of comments that are coming in, and Celia was bringing up the point of we saw sorry, Mandy Ann was talking about how she's speaking to a story that left her feeling really drained, which I think is interesting. And then Celia is talking about an episode of Bones that made activists look mentally unstable or violent. But they also did that episode, which I loved, on a Free Cycle, where of eating out of the car. They did a whole thing on and it's one of my favorite episodes where this guy takes a girl out on a date to go dumpster diving for food, and and it's talking about like all the excess waste. And to me, that was actually one of the more funny episodes where, like, yeah, it showed that there's this ridiculous amount of excess waste that could be feeding so many people. And yeah, they didn't quite paint them in the most amazing of ways. So it's like, how can we make these slight shifts, where it's like, right, they're pointing to this, but also how do we make the people that are in it not be outsiders or other them in the process of doing it? How can we laugh with them rather than laugh at them? And I think those are those small, like, taekwondo moves that we can make as storytellers, where to be aware of those small distinctions that can really change another person's perspective of explaining something.
Maybe could I add real quickly? I think also it's about systemic changes too, like individual portrayals and action is so important, obviously, and how can we, inspire other people through changing our habits and talking about it to make those changes. But at the same time, the corporations want you to believe that individual action is the most important thing, but it's not. It's systemic. If a couple companies in this world changed the way that they behaved, we would be in a very different place. And so for me, I like to think a lot about, like, I guess bringing in like more collective action stories and yeah, like obviously telling and making it activism, telling a story about activism, but telling it in a way where it's like a bunch of kids in their middle school, they wanted to like change this thing at middle school or whatever. So they came together and, at the end of the day, it's like, I'm not seeing these middle schoolers as activists. I'm seeing them as like, they wanted to make a change at their school and they did it. And this is how they did it. And right. And then other people are learning, oh, maybe I can make this change at my school. So it's really about like modeling behaviors that can lead to large changes versus, the small things that at the end of the day, it's like me, unfortunately, like using plastic water bottles isn't really gonna make that much change. Do I want to use them? No, but it's just, that's sort of the way it is.
I love where you're going with this. And I think it's a great way to start making our exit towards the end of this conversation, which is what's one thing, if there's one thing that you could go after and start to needle on or redesign in terms of what we're talking about, the climate narrative. And Allison, that was so, like, I am so with you. It's like, that's lovely. Yes, we all want to change our light bulbs and do one thing, but to me, what I see as one of the greater narrative, falsities, I don't know if that's a real word, is that one person can make a difference. The truth is that many people live within systems run by very few. And that it's the very few who are profiting off of these systems that we should be targeting our focus and attention on. And if we did that, rather than focusing on separating our recycling, which we do, we compost and do all the things, but it's like, how is our energy going to have the greatest amount of long form impact? And I think, like, if we could organize that way, that's amazing. So thank you for bringing that up as a key piece of the narrative, and again, it's like, and I really appreciate what you said before, Allison, it's like understanding when a story is told in the context of its time and that they're all evolving. And at some point we want to know that we all make a difference, but also it's like, how do we have the greatest impact? For me, I think one of the things that I'm really after is this whole idea that we have to race to save the planet. That's the biggest bunch of baloney I've ever heard. And I was raised on that. And the reason why I'm now against that narrative is something that Casey, you said. It's like, we're in here for the marathon, not for the sprint. And I've seen so many young activists burn out and get extremely bad immune deficiencies and adrenal deficiencies because they're running off of that story that we're in this great marathon, that we're in a marathon that's being run 24/7, and it's knocking out some of the most and best, brightest lights that we have. And when, like, all the ancient wisdom teachers, all of our creation stories, our origin stories, they tell us the turtle wins the race. It's all right there, slow and easy. And it's like, and we saw it during COVID, that if we could just slow down, the coral began to restore. We had blue skies in LA. It's like we had a return of so many different things. And that's just, and that's like we have tangible, practical understanding that narrative, while again created because we wanted to activate people, maybe sure it woke them up. But it's like, is it truly, I love also this new change. We're not using the word sustainable anymore because that's status quo. Now we've moved into the world of, no, we want regenerative culture. We want to live in a regenerative world. We don't want to just sustain, I love how we're tweaking, we're growing, we're tweaking. Anything else that anyone else sees, in Casey, what you see in terms of, how can we just be tweaking this greater narrative, this greater storytelling together?
Well, I think I would be regretting if I didn't bring forward the idea of community. And Allison, when you were talking about systemic change, this came to mind, and Leah, your comments just now, that the idea that our storytelling or our activism happens in isolation is, the only thing I can say is that it's a very Western notion. It has like a short lifespan, and if you think of like, over time. And that I think anybody who's involved in any justice related work, obviously climate related work, as you referenced, Leah, right, it is a long effort, a long-term effort, and it's best to go with others. And I think that that's true when it comes to any activism work. It's certainly true when, thinking about systemic change, right? Not at the individual level, but at systemic, much larger level. And that so much power comes from community, whether that is a few neighbors getting together, it's a university system, it's, an entire organization, a corporation, like however you want to think of that community, that the more we can situate ourselves within community for our actions and activism, I think the longer we're going to go, the more creativity that we're going to find, and more heart, right? Because then it becomes about relationship in addition to action.
I love that. And there was someone, and Celia might remember, I don't remember who it was, but some, notable leader was saying, we need a better party for the planet. And it's like, and I gotta say, like, the best parties I've been to have been with activists, who've been with people who are in line with their passion and protecting what they care about. And those are some really fun parties. So if nothing else, like, go to the best parties in the world by connecting with people who you're passionate, who you share passion with. There's so many comments that are coming in, and I think the way that might be a fun way to end is a little vision story. Maybe we can end with planting a little vision story. And by doing that, and I invite all of you to place something in the chat, and maybe Allison and Casey can start us off. But if we could, if we see ourselves, let's go close. Let's go like 30 years in the future. Okay, we'll go 50 years in the future. What the heck? We're gonna go 50 years in the future, and we won. We won. And by winning, we mean that we've created a way, we've remembered how to for there to be a way where all the beings that share this planet, can live in a way that supports life. What's one thing that you see? If you're there, and like, how does it feel? Are you walking down the street and you're hungry and you pick a peach off the tree because all your streets are now filled with fruit trees, and there's no reason for anyone to go hungry because we have food forests in every urban area. What's one thing you see? You go to your local coffee shop, and there's no such thing as disposable culture anymore. So you have your special bag that has all your little things in, which they already are doing in Europe anyway. Like what's the one thing that you're seeing that says we landed it? We landed it. We learned, we shifted, we evolved.
Well, look, I live in Los Angeles, so I'm going to say we are all biking. They have figured out biking in Los Angeles, because if they can figure out there, they can figure it out anywhere, and we can stop using cars. The end.
Yes. love that. I love that. As long as we have a tram that goes from the top of Topanga to the bottom, that I can put my bike on, and then I can drive, I'm all good with that.
And public transportation.
Yes. Casey?
Yeah, I said very green in the chat. The other thing I would just say is, you know, I'm based in Santa Barbara, California. There's a lot of agriculture around. You know, I wish for a day not to just see an entire green, perfectly manicured agricultural space, right? You know, this idea that that farms can be growing many things all at once, looking a bit more chaotic, if you will, right? Not quite as exact and perfect from, you know, large scale farming, but moving, like visualizing what a more regenerative approach would look like.
I love that. I love that. Lady G is saying that new housing designs. We don't have single home suburbs based on cars anymore. Vivian's talking about the whole planet becomes a blue zone. Oh, that sounds nice. That would be a change in life. Sylvie's saying nature's rhyme. Right, Casey's it's really green. The seasons are more normal, says Florence. I can train or bike more places. And Clemmy's talking about no traffic problems. This is a theme, okay. And Mary is talking about abundant water for all. Nice. And Karen's talking about we have found new enzymes that compost plastics. Ooh, I love that. That's a great one. You know, and one of my fantasies is that somehow we have repaired our interspecies communication, because they say that back in the day humans could talk to, you know, all the species could communicate, and we're communicating with trees. And when every child is, I don't know, like we've made it so that our trees actually grow in such a way that we can live inside of them rather than cut them down. I think that would be like, you know, whole new realm of treehouse. Thank you for all of this. Like, how do we get to follow you? If you guys can both put your links in there, and if people want to continue to follow what you are creating and making and finding, that'd be amazing. And thank you all for coming to this conversation. Celia, who I'm just saying, Celia is going to be teaching another class for the School for Sacred Storytelling, and that's on Saturday at 3 p.m. And it's going to be a really, truly wonderful class on, I don't have it up in front of me. Celia, you surprised me, but it's going to be a great class. We've got so many more free classes coming. One of them starts at 5 o'clock, and it's all about writing your own memoir. And we have another one at 6 o'clock told from an Indigenous woman from Australia about deep listening and how to create our stories from this place that feed our legacies. And so I strongly recommend, I'll put links in so that you can get all the information about that. And if anything else wants to be said, we can go on our way. Okay.
Thank you, Leah. Really nice to be with you and Allison.
Thank you all so much. This was really special.
It was a pleasure. I recommend that everyone take yourselves off mute. I'm going to put you guys back on gallery view and invite you to take yourselves off mute and give a little hoot and a holler and a call out to this crew. And thank you all for being part of this conversation.
Thank you all for being
Thank
here
you.
and presenting and sharing so freely with us.
Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you. Mahalo.
Love
Aloha.
the energy. Good energy.